Okay, today I'm going to be showing you motion blur inside of Sony Vegas and how to get it in there, how to make it work. But before I get started on that, what is motion blur? Well, it'd probably be easier if I just showed you. So, got a picture here which was taken from FanFest. Now, I used a digital camera and I had the shutter speed on the camera set to really high so I get a nice crisp shot, and you can see that it's pretty stable. There's no blurring on there. And I got another shot here, which was taken same camera but with a very low shutter speed. Now, by doing that, everything that's static and not moving doesn't have any blurring to it, but anything that's moving quickly has this blurring. Like Nathan here is looking pretty blurry, and people that are standing still, hardly any sort of blur on them at all. So that's motion blur right there. But how do you compare motion blur? Well, I do like that picture, by the way. I'm going to jump into After Effects very quickly and just give you an example. So I've got a very simple composition here with a smiley face and a non-smiley face, and they're just going to go backwards and forwards from there, and neither of them have any motion blur applied to them, and you can see that's fairly static. Now, if I was to, let me just come back to the beginning here, apply some motion blur to them, and as soon as we start to get some speed, so around about here is probably the fastest point. This one doesn't have any motion blur, but as you can see this one does, and this one's blurring out because, and then as it slows down it loses its motion blur, and as it speeds up again it gets more blur applied to it. So if you can imagine these were two ships in space, one of them would be like that and one of them would have the motion blur, and obviously if I turn them off you can see that we go back to normal. Now, how do we get motion blur in a EVE Online film? Well, I'm going to show you Sony Vegas in a minute, but something that would be a good example for an EVE Online film that was made last year is The Day of Darkness. Now, I've paused it here at this moment because this is when we got to see, there we go, bit of motion blur there. You can see there on the edge of the ship it's a little bit blurry. Just going to move forward here, see a few more shots. See, look, bit of motion blur there. Move forward. See, look, we've got some motion blur happening. It's kind of blurred out. See, look, we've got a trail there from the edge of the station, the asteroids, and look at that. Look at that motion blur all over there. And what this does is it gives the impression that the EVE Online film was filmed with a real camera and not just fraps from the video card, and gives you that sort of real world realism, which is just impossible to get with just using fraps files. So let's go into Sony Vegas and I'll show you how to get motion blur into your EVE Online film. Okay, so here we are, and I'm just going to get some footage in like so, and I'm just going to drag this down onto the timeline. Now, this is a pretty straightforward shot of a rifter warping away from the station, and I'll play that through now. So you can see rifter goes into warp, aligns, warps away, enters warp, past a planet, and past the sun as well. So if this was shot with a real camera in space that was just ahead of this rifter here, the sun should blur. The planet, as we go past it, should also blur because it's moving really fast, it has a lot of motion, and the stations should sort of progressively blur the faster that we accelerate away from the station. So how do we get those things to blur? Well, fortunately Sony Vegas pretty much has a switch that we can just flick just to get our motion blur. And the way to do that is to go to the video bus track. Now, if you don't have the video bus track, you want to go to View, Video Bus Track, and all we have to do now is right click on the video bus track, go to Insert Remove Envelope, and select Motion Blur Amount, like so. And then we have to click on Automation Settings and Show Automation Controls. There we go. And now we have a slider for motion blur, which we can just move up and down and apply motion blur, and you can see that happening over here. And I can even make that a little bit bigger, so you can see that. There we go. So you can see this slider dictates how long the motion blur length is going to be. So if you just want a little bit of motion blur, you know, you might want to push that up to 0.1, maybe 0.2, get a bit of motion blur on there. Or if you want really long motion blur, just go all the way to 1 and you get a huge amount of motion blur. I'm just going to set this to draft auto for a second so that we lose that motion blur, just so I can scrub through. Let's find that planet and see how much motion blur we can apply to it. So probably just about there should do it. Go back to best auto for the preview, and wow, look at that. If I drop that down, you can see that's no motion blur. So 0.1, bit of motion blur, 0.2, a little bit more, and then just wild and crazy amounts of motion blur if we go all the way to 1. And do the same again for the sun. So just put it back to draft auto for a second. Move forward. So the sun is moving its most at probably about that point there. Go back to best. Let's increase the motion blur. So 0.5, you can see that's, you know, pretty blurry. You can go all the way to 1, you see that's really blurry. Now the ship hardly has any motion blur to it because the ship is hardly moving. So as I say, the things which are moving the most will always have the most amount of motion blur, and this slider, like I say, just allows us to dictate how much motion blur or how long the trails for the motion blur are going to be. Now if you want to increase the quality of the motion blur, what you can do is right click and choose video super sampling, like so. And then you've got to pull down here to select video sampling. Now super sampling decides how many times it's going to calculate the motion blur and the trails of the motion blur. So I just want to pre-warn you that if you set that to 8 times super sampling, the render time would be absolutely huge. And I just want to prove that point. Let's set the motion blur all the way up, and we know we've got the super sampling set to 8 times. I'm just going to move forward 1 frame, and you can see here it's now sort of got these dots, and that's it calculating 1 frame ahead. And if you were to do a final render, which take a long time anyway, that would be probably take a good couple of days, unless you're using some 8-core super Xeon dual 8GB mega super Cray 15 computer of some kind. But you might just be able to see that the quality of that motion blur on that sun has increased dramatically, and you know, that's how it would look normally, and there it is without the motion blur. Sorry, there it is with the motion blur. So I think motion blur is a really great way to improve the quality of the EVE Online film that you're going to be making, and certainly if you're making EVE Online films which have lots of shots where you don't see the graphical user interface, and there's lots of sort of beauty shots, as I like to call them, then you know, having motion blur will really give you that edge on the quality. That's until CCP give us motion blur. You can just use Sony Vegas just by flicking that motion blur switch, and make your EVE Online films look really good. But once you've got the fraps in, and start playing around and see what works best for you, and just go from there. Oh, by the way, you can alter these keyframes down here. So this purple line, let me just zoom in here, this represents the amount of motion blur, so we've ramped it up there, so there's lots of motion blur at that point, and it's come back down again. We can move these keyframes around just by clicking and dragging on them, and if you want to create new keyframes, then you can just increase from there, and you can just endlessly move these keyframes around and decide how much motion blur you're going to have. My general recommendation on the amount of motion blur though is going to be about 0.1 to 0.2, just to give you that little bit of motion blur. But like I say, if you want to go crazy, push it all the way up to 1, and just have fun with it. But there you are. That's motion blur, and I hope you start using motion blur, because I think it looks great. And once you got everything set up the way you want it, you are good to go.